Have you ever looked in the mirror and not recognized the person staring back at you? For Reiko Kobayashi, a Japanese prisoner of war liberated in 1945, that nightmare became reality. Starved, broken, and stripped of her identity, she stood before a mirror in a U.S. military hospital, unable to comprehend that the skeletal stranger reflected there was her, until one American nurse whispered 3 words that changed everything. This is the story of survival, trauma, and the moment one woman reclaimed her humanity. The Philippines, February 1945. The air smelled of ash and blood. Commander William Foster led his battalion through the gates of a Japanese internment camp near Manila, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rows of makeshift barracks, barbed wire stretching endlessly, and inside, hundreds of women who looked more like ghosts than human beings. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies skeletal, their hair matted and crawling with lice. These were not enemy combatants. These were civilian prisoners, Japanese women who had been caught in the crossfire of war, detained by their own military under suspicion of espionage or simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Among them was Reiko Kobayashi, 24 years old, though she looked twice that age. She had been a schoolteacher in Manila before the war, teaching children to read and write, dreaming of one day opening her own school. But when Japan invaded the Philippines, everything changed. Accusations flew. Loyalties were questioned. Reiko was arrested by Japanese military police accused of having ties to Filipino resistance fighters. She protested her innocence, but in wartime, innocence meant nothing. She was thrown into the camp with hundreds of other women, left to rot in conditions that defied human decency. For 3 years, Reiko survived on rice gruel so thin you could see through it, sometimes mixed with weevils and dirt. She watched women around her waste away, their bodies giving up one organ at a time. She watched Chieko Endo, a woman who had once been a nurse in Tokyo, use her bare hands to try to save the dying, though she had no medicine, no tools, nothing but her will to help. Chieko became Reiko's closest companion, the only reason she kept fighting to see another day. They made a pact, whispered in the dead of night when the guards weren't listening. If one of them survived, she would tell the world what happened here. She would make sure their suffering was not forgotten. But survival came at a cost. Reiko's body began to shut down. Her menstrual cycle stopped. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her teeth loosened. Her skin, once smooth and warm, became papery and pale, stretched tight over bones that jutted out like broken branches. She stopped looking at her reflection in the murky water they were given to wash with. She stopped thinking of herself as Reiko. She became a number, a body, a thing that moved through the motions of existence without truly living. Then, one morning, the gates opened. American soldiers poured in, their faces a mixture of shock and rage. Commander Foster barked orders, his voice trembling with emotion he couldn't hide. Get these women out of here. Get them to the hospital. Now. Reiko didn't understand what was happening. She heard the other women crying, some collapsing to their knees in relief. But she felt nothing. Her mind had learned to shut down to protect itself, and now, even in the face of liberation, she couldn't feel joy. She couldn't feel anything. The women were loaded onto trucks and transported to a U.S. Army evacuation hospital in Leyte. The hospital was a sprawling network of canvas tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings, filled with the wounded from both sides of the war. But a separate section had been set up for the female prisoners, staffed by American military nurses who had volunteered for the assignment. Among them was Nurse Ruth Bennett, a 28-year-old from Iowa who had joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1942, driven by a desire to serve her country and make a difference. Ruth had seen her share of horrors during the war. She had treated soldiers with limbs blown off, men screaming in agony, boys who would never see their families again. But nothing prepared her for the women who arrived from the camps. They were skeletal, their eyes vacant, their bodies covered in sores and infections. Many couldn't walk on their own. Some were catatonic, staring into space, unable to respond to questions. Ruth felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. These women needed her. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Reiko was assigned to Ruth's care. When Ruth first saw her, she had to fight to keep her expression neutral. Reiko weighed less than 80 pounds. Her cheekbones jutted out sharply, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. Her hair, once thick and black, was now brittle and patchy. Her arms were little more than bone wrapped in skin. Ruth approached slowly, speaking in a soft, gentle voice. Though she knew Reiko likely didn't understand English. She gestured for Reiko to sit on the cot, and Reiko obeyed, moving like a mechanical doll. The first step was basic hygiene. Ruth filled a basin with warm water, something Reiko hadn't felt in years. She began to wash Reiko's face, gently wiping away layers of grime and dried sweat. Reiko flinched at first, her body conditioned to expect pain from every touch. But Ruth kept her movements slow and deliberate, murmuring reassurances even though she knew Reiko couldn't understand the words. "It's okay. You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." Ruth worked methodically, washing Reiko's arms, her neck, her hands. She trimmed Reiko's nails, which had grown long and jagged. She carefully cut away the matted sections of Reiko's hair, revealing patches of scalp that were red and inflamed. Private James Chen, a Japanese-American translator who had been assigned to the hospital, stood nearby, ready to help communicate. But Ruth found that words weren't always necessary. Sometimes, a gentle touch said more than any translation could. Still, when it came time to explain what would happen next, James stepped in. He spoke to Reiko in Japanese, his voice calm and respectful. "The nurse is going to help you get clean. She's going to treat your wounds. You're safe here. You're free." Reiko stared at him, her expression blank. Free. The word meant nothing to her. She had forgotten what freedom felt like. Over the next few days, Ruth and the other nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize the women. They treated infections, administered vitamin injections to combat malnutrition, and slowly introduced solid food, though many of the women's digestive systems couldn't handle it at first. Captain Helen Rhodes, the chief medical officer, fought with military bureaucracy to secure additional supplies. These women need more than the standard rations. They need specialized care, they need time, and they need compassion. Helen was a formidable woman, respected and feared in equal measure, and she used every ounce of her authority to ensure her patients received the best care possible. Chieko Endo was in the bed next to Reiko's. She was in slightly better condition, having used her medical knowledge to keep herself alive. She and Reiko would hold hands at night, a silent acknowledgement of their shared suffering. Chieko began to recover more quickly, her body responding to the nourishment and care. She started to smile again, a small, fragile thing, but a smile nonetheless. She tried to encourage Reiko to do the same, but Reiko remained locked inside herself, unreachable. One afternoon, about a week after their arrival, Ruth decided it was time to introduce Reiko to something she hadn't seen in years: a mirror. Ruth had noticed that many of the women avoided reflective surfaces, turning away from windows, closing their eyes when they passed anything that might show their reflection. She understood why. These women had been stripped of their identities, reduced to shells of their former selves. Seeing what they had become was too painful. But Ruth also believed that part of healing was confronting reality, reclaiming the self that had been stolen. She brought a small hand mirror, the kind nurses used for patient care, and set it on the table beside Reiko's bed. Reiko glanced at it but didn't reach for it. Ruth picked it up and held it out, gesturing for Reiko to look. James was nearby, and Ruth asked him to translate. "The nurse wants you to see yourself. She thinks it might help." Reiko shook her head, fear flashing in her eyes. Ruth didn't push. She simply placed the mirror on the bed and walked away, giving Reiko the choice. Hours passed. Reiko stared at the mirror, her heart pounding. She was terrified of what she might see. But curiosity, that deeply human trait, began to gnaw at her. Who was she now? What had she become? Slowly, with trembling hands, she picked up the mirror and held it in front of her face. And then she froze. The face staring back at her was unrecognizable. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, cracked lips, skin stretched tight over bone. This couldn't be her. This was someone else. Some other woman. Some other victim. She dropped the mirror, and it clattered to the floor. She began to shake, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Ruth heard the commotion and rushed over. She saw the mirror on the floor, saw Reiko's hands covering her face, saw the tears streaming through her fingers. Ruth knelt beside the bed and gently took Reiko's hands in hers, pulling them away from her face. She looked directly into Reiko's eyes, and even though they didn't share a language, Ruth knew what Reiko needed to hear. She called for James, who came quickly. "Tell her," Ruth said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Tell her that it's her. Tell her she survived. Tell her she's still here." James translated, his own voice thick with feeling. "That's you, Reiko. You survived. You're still here." Reiko shook her head violently, tears pouring down her face. No, that's not me. I'm not that person. I don't know who that is." Ruth squeezed her hands tighter, refusing to let go. She looked at James. "Tell her again. Tell her it's her. Tell her she's alive and that's what matters." James repeated the words and Ruth leaned in closer, her face inches from Reiko's. "It's you," she whispered, even though Reiko couldn't understand the English words. "It's you. You survived." And then something broke inside Reiko. The wall she had built around herself, the numbness that had protected her from the unbearable pain, it all came crashing down. She sobbed, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Ruth pulled her into an embrace, holding her as she cried, letting her release years of anguish and terror and grief. Chieko reached over from her bed, placing a hand on Reiko's shoulder, tears streaming down her own face. Other nurses stopped what they were doing, moved by the raw emotion in the room. Even Commander Foster, who had come to check on the patients, stood in the doorway, his eyes glistening. That moment, that simple act of recognition, became the turning point in Reiko's recovery. Over the following weeks, she began to eat more, to speak more, to engage with the world around her. Ruth continued to care for her, and a bond formed between them that transcended language and nationality. Ruth learned bits of Japanese from James, simple phrases to comfort Reiko. "You are strong. You are brave. You will heal." And Reiko, in turn, began to learn English, starting with the words Ruth had whispered to her that day. "It's you. You survived." Chieko recovered alongside Reiko, and the two women became inseparable. They talked about what they would do when they were well enough to leave the hospital. Chieko wanted to return to nursing, to use her skills to help others who had suffered. Reiko wasn't sure what she wanted. Her old life, her dreams of teaching felt like they belonged to someone else. But Ruth encouraged her. "You can be whoever you want to be now. You have a second chance. Don't waste it." Captain Helen Rhodes worked with the Red Cross to help the women find their families, though many had lost everyone. Reiko learned that her parents and younger brother had died during an air raid on Tokyo. The news devastated her, but it also gave her a sense of closure. She was alone in the world now, but she was free. And freedom, she was beginning to realize, was worth fighting for. Private James Chen spent hours talking with the women, translating their stories, helping them process their trauma. He struggled with his own identity, torn between his Japanese heritage and his American loyalty. But working with these women gave him a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a translator. He was a bridge, helping to heal wounds that went deeper than physical scars. Commander Foster returned to the hospital several times, checking on the progress of the women he had liberated. He felt a personal responsibility for them, as if saving them from the camp wasn't enough. He needed to see them recover, to know that his actions had made a difference. When he saw Reiko walking on her own, her hair starting to grow back, a faint smile on her lips, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "This is why we fight," he thought. Not for territory or politics, but for moments like this. For the chance to give someone their life back. Months passed. The war ended. Japan surrendered. The world began the long, painful process of rebuilding. Reiko and Chieko were eventually deemed healthy enough to leave the hospital. The Red Cross helped them secure passage to the United States, where they could start new lives far from the memories of the camp. Ruth stayed in touch with Reiko, writing letters, sending care packages, visiting whenever she could. Their friendship became a lifeline for both of them, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could prevail. Reiko eventually settled in California, where a small Japanese-American community welcomed her. She took classes, learned English fluently, and after much encouragement from Ruth, went back to teaching. She started small, tutoring children in her neighborhood, but eventually she opened a school, just as she had dreamed. It was a place where children of all backgrounds could learn together, where differences were celebrated, not feared. She named it the Phoenix School, a symbol of rising from the ashes. Chieko became a nurse in San Francisco, working with refugees and trauma survivors. She never forgot the women she had tried to save in the camp, and she dedicated her life to making sure no one else suffered the way they had. She and Reiko remained close, visiting each other often, their bond forged in the fires of shared suffering. Ruth returned to Iowa after the war, but she never forgot the women she had cared for in the Philippines. She became an advocate for trauma survivors, speaking at conferences, writing articles, pushing for better mental health care for veterans and refugees. She kept a photograph of Reiko on her desk, a reminder of why her work mattered. Whenever she felt discouraged, she would look at that photo and remember the moment in the hospital when Reiko finally recognized herself. It's you. You survived. Years later, Reiko was invited to speak at a veterans event in Washington, D.C. She was nervous, unsure if she could find the words to describe what she had endured. But when she stood at the podium and looked out at the audience, she saw Ruth sitting in the front row, smiling at her with tears in her eyes, and Reiko found her voice. She spoke about the camp, about the women who didn't survive, about the moment she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself, and she spoke about Ruth, the nurse who had whispered 3 words that brought her back to life. It's you. You survived. The audience gave her a standing ovation, but Reiko only had eyes for Ruth. After the speech, they embraced, 2 women who had been brought together by war and bound by compassion. Reiko lived a long, full life. She married, had children, watched her school grow and thrive. She never forgot the camp, never forgot the women who died there, but she also never let that suffering define her. She chose to honor their memory by living fully, by embracing every moment of freedom she had been given. When she was in her 80s, frail but still sharp, she was interviewed for a documentary about women prisoners of war. The interviewer asked her what kept her going during those dark years in the camp. Reiko thought for a moment, her eyes distant, remembering, and then she smiled. Hope, she said. And later, a nurse who reminded me that I was still human, that I was still me. Ruth passed away before Reiko, but Reiko made sure her friend's legacy lived on. She established a scholarship in Ruth's name for nursing students who wanted to work in trauma care. She told Ruth's story whenever she could, making sure the world knew about the compassion and courage of the woman who had saved her life, not with medicine, but with 3 simple words. It's you. You survived. And so, the story of Reiko Kobayashi and Ruth Bennett became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest times, a single act of kindness can change everything. It became a story passed down through generations, taught in schools, shared in books and films. It became a symbol of what humanity could be at its best, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. Chieko Endo, too, left her mark on the world. She worked tirelessly in San Francisco's Japantown, helping former internees and prisoners rebuild their lives. She opened a small clinic where she treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, and she trained a new generation of nurses in the art of compassionate care. She never married, dedicating her life entirely to her work, but she found fulfillment in the lives she touched and the suffering she eased. When she retired in her 70s, the community threw her a celebration that filled an entire block. Former patients came from across the country to thank her, to tell her how she had changed their lives. Chieko stood before them, tears streaming down her face, and said simply, "I learned how to survive from the women in that camp. Everything I did after was just paying that forward." Captain Helen Rhodes continued her military career after the war, rising to the rank of colonel before retiring. She became a vocal advocate for military medical reform, pushing for better mental health services and more comprehensive care for trauma survivors. She wrote a memoir about her experiences in the Philippines, detailing the conditions she witnessed and the heroic efforts of the nurses under her command. The book became required reading at military medical schools, and Helen spent her later years lecturing at universities and hospitals around the world. She stayed in contact with many of the women she had treated, including Reiko and Chieko, and she attended the opening of Reiko's school, standing in the back of the room with tears in her eyes as she watched her former patient address a room full of hopeful children. Private James Chen faced his own battles after the war. Returning to the United States as a Japanese-American veteran was complicated. He had fought for his country while his own family had been held in internment camps in California. The contradiction weighed heavily on him, and for years he struggled with depression and anger. But his work with the women prisoners in the Philippines had shown him the power of bridge building, of using his unique position to help others. He became a translator and advocate for Japanese American communities, helping families navigate the legal system, find housing, and rebuild their lives. He married a woman he had met in one of the internment camps, and together they raised 3 children, teaching them to be proud of both their Japanese heritage and their American identity. James never forgot the women he had helped in the hospital, and he made sure his children knew their stories, understood the cost of prejudice and the value of compassion. Commander William Foster returned to civilian life and became a high school history teacher in Boston. He could have pursued a military career, could have risen through the ranks, but what he had seen in the Philippines changed him. He wanted to teach young people about the realities of war, not the glorified version found in textbooks, but the human cost, the suffering, the moral complexity. He brought guest speakers to his classes, including Reiko, who came several times to share her story with his students. Foster's students remembered him as a man who cared deeply about truth, who refused to let them look away from uncomfortable realities, but who also inspired them to believe in the possibility of redemption and healing. When he died in his 70s, Reiko attended his funeral, placing a single white flower on his casket and whispering a prayer of gratitude in Japanese. The story of the mirror, of Ruth's whispered words, became the centerpiece of Reiko's talks and writings. She explained that the moment wasn't just about physical recognition. It was about reclaiming her humanity, her identity, her sense of self that had been systematically stripped away. In the camp, she had been reduced to a number, a body, a thing. But in that moment, looking into Ruth's eyes, hearing those words translated by James, she became Reiko again. She became a person with a past, a present, and a future. That's what trauma does, she would tell audiences. It erases you. It makes you disappear, even from yourself. And healing is about finding your way back, one small step at a time, often with the help of someone who sees you when you can't see yourself. Reiko's school thrived for decades. It became a model for multicultural education, a place where children learned not just academics but empathy, resilience, and the importance of standing up against injustice. Former students went on to become teachers, doctors, activists, and leaders in their communities. Many of them credited Reiko with changing their lives, with showing them what it meant to overcome adversity with grace and strength. The school's motto, chosen by Reiko herself, was simple but powerful. You survived. Now live. It was a reminder that survival was just the first step. The real challenge, the real triumph, was in choosing to live fully, to love deeply, to contribute meaningfully despite the scars. In her final years, Reiko returned to Japan for the first time since the war. She visited the sites of the camps, now overgrown with vegetation marked only by small plaques and fading photographs. She stood in the place where she had suffered, where she had nearly died, and she felt a strange sense of peace. This place no longer had power over her. She had taken back her life, her identity, her future. She placed flowers at the memorial for the women who hadn't survived, whispering their names, promising them that their suffering had not been forgotten, that their stories would continue to be told. She also visited Ruth's grave in Iowa, making the long journey with her children and grandchildren. She stood before the simple headstone, tears streaming down her face, and spoke to her old friend. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for reminding me that I was still human, still worthy, still here. Her grandchildren placed flowers on the grave, and Reiko told them stories about the brave nurse who had saved their grandmother's life, with nothing more than warm water, gentle hands, and 3 whispered words. The documentary featuring Reiko's interview won several awards and was shown in schools and museums around the world. It sparked conversations about the treatment of prisoners of war, the long-term effects of trauma, and the importance of compassionate care and healing. Reiko received letters from survivors of other conflicts, other atrocities, thanking her for putting words to their experiences, for showing them that recovery was possible. She answered every letter personally, even as her health declined, because she knew how much it meant to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged. When Reiko passed away at the age of 92, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Former students, fellow survivors, nurses who had been inspired by Ruth's example, historians who had documented her story, activists who had been moved by her advocacy. Chieko, now in her late 90s and frail, sat in the front row, holding a photograph of the two of them taken in the hospital all those years ago. In the photo, they were both skeletal, their eyes haunted, but they were holding hands, and there was something in their expressions, a glimmer of hope, a determination to survive. The eulogy was given by one of Reiko's former students, now a prominent civil rights lawyer. She spoke about Reiko's courage, her resilience, her unwavering commitment to education and justice. But she also spoke about the mirror, about the moment when Reiko couldn't recognize herself, and about the nurse who helped her find her way back. That moment, she said, is a metaphor for what we all face at some point in our lives. We all have moments when we lose ourselves, when trauma or grief or fear makes us unrecognizable even to ourselves. And in those moments, we need someone to hold up a mirror, to look us in the eye, and remind us who we are. Reiko was that person for so many of us. She held up the mirror. She reminded us of our strength, our worth, our humanity. And now it's our turn to do the same for others. After the funeral, Reiko's family donated her personal papers to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where they joined the archives of other survivors of wartime atrocities. Her story became part of the permanent exhibition, a reminder that the horrors of war extend far beyond the battlefield, that civilians suffer immeasurably, and that healing requires not just medical care, but human connection, compassion, and the simple act of seeing someone as a person, not a victim. The Phoenix School continued to operate long after Reiko's death, run by a board of directors that included several of her former students. They expanded the curriculum to include courses on trauma, resilience, and social justice, ensuring that Reiko's legacy would continue to shape young minds for generations to come. Every year, on the anniversary of the day Reiko looked in the mirror and couldn't recognize herself, the school held a special assembly. Students learned about her story, about Ruth Bennett, about the other women who suffered in the camps. And then, in a powerful ritual, each student was given a small mirror and asked to look at themselves, to really see themselves, and to whisper the words Ruth had spoken all those years ago. It's you. You survived. Now live. The story of Reiko Kobayashi and Ruth Bennett became more than just a historical footnote. It became a testament to the power of compassion in the face of cruelty, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering, and the importance of bearing witness to the truth, no matter how painful. It reminded the world that in the darkest times, a single act of kindness, a single moment of recognition can change a life. And it challenged everyone who heard it to ask themselves, when someone is lost, will I be the one to help them find their way back? When someone can't see themselves, will I hold up the mirror and remind them who they are? Years after Reiko's death, a young nurse named Sarah, working in a refugee camp in the Middle East, heard Reiko's story during her training. She was treating a young Syrian woman who had been tortured and traumatized, who couldn't speak, couldn't eat, couldn't look anyone in the eye. Sarah remembered Reiko's story, remembered Ruth's gentle approach, her patient care, her whispered words. So Sarah brought a mirror just as Ruth had done. She held it up, and when the young woman recoiled in horror at her own reflection, Sarah took her hands, looked into her eyes, and said softly in Arabic, the language James Chen had helped her learn for moments like this. It's you. You survived. You're still here. And just like Reiko all those years ago, the young woman broke down, sobbing, and began the long, painful journey back to herself. And so the story continued, passed from generation to generation, from one caregiver to another, from one survivor to the next. It became a thread connecting people across time and space, a reminder that we are all capable of both immense cruelty and profound compassion, and that the choice between the two defines not just our individual lives, but the future of humanity itself. Reiko Kobayashi looked in a mirror and didn't recognize herself. But Ruth Bennett saw her, truly saw her, and with 3 simple words brought her back. It's you. You survived. And in surviving, in reclaiming her identity and her humanity, Reiko showed the world what it means to truly live. If you found this story moving, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of survival and resilience. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to like this video to help us reach more people with these important stories. Thank you for watching.